at the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Gatineau, where I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Victor Rabinovitch, President and CEO of the corporation. He has a display of artifacts about Canadian politicians. Mr. Rabinovitch, could you tell me a little bit about yourself, what it is that you do here at the Museum of Civilization?
Well, I'm the director of the Museum of Civilization. The official title is President and CEO, which is a highfalutin name. So I'm responsible for the overall operations of the museum, as well as for the Museum of Military History, the Canadian War Museum. The two museums, Civilization and War, are part of the same museum corporation. My own background is partly civil service and partly educational. I have a doctorate in politics and history from Sussex University in England and a first degree from McGill University. And I worked in the Public Service of Canada for, a good 20 years before I was headhunted and recruited and brought into this job here. It's quite a wonderful job.
What brought us here today is a display of items that are connected to political life in Canada entitled Love 'Em, Hate 'Em. Can you tell me who put this collection together and what was the inspiration behind it?
Well, I actually put the exhibition together. It was at the request of some of the other staff at the museum who said that they thought it was time for the director to get his hands dirty and have to do something really hands-on. And I was thinking about some of the items in our national collection. You know, we have a collection here of, at least 1 million artifacts that go back to all kinds of aspects of Canadian life, society, history, before the arrival of Europeans, after the arrival of Europeans and others. What I was thinking about were several items of a more political nature. One is a photograph. It's a photographic reproduction of the negotiations in Charlottetown back in 1864 that led to the creation of the resolutions that later became the basis for the BNA Act of 1867. And this photograph shows the various representatives from the different colonies that then made up Canada, and they all look so respectable. They're wearing their dark frock coats. They are men. All of them are men. They are men of great honor. They appear in the most respectable way with their top hats in their hands. We can look at them. We can see John A. Macdonald seated on the ground. He may have been in his cups just a little bit, and that's why he's seated at that point of the day. We have Sir Georges-Étienne Cartier looking beautifully set out, his hair beautifully combed back. Behind them, the great D'Arcy McGee, almost scowling into the camera. D'Arcy McGee, one of Canada's great spokesmen, and all of them together as a group, highly respectable. And then if we jump ahead to the early 1980s, everyone will remember the constitutional debates of the time and the negotiations that Mr. Trudeau had begun after his re-election. And what we have in the museum is this wonderful carving in folk style that shows the premiers of Canada in a canoe with Pierre Elliott Trudeau in the stern of the canoe. And these are 10 plus Mr. Trudeau, 11 squabbling politicians. And they are really very, very humorous. You have Mr. Trudeau himself kind of looking forward, and sitting in his lap is Bill Davis, the Premier of Ontario. So Ontario's in Canada's lap. Ontario's in the federal government's lap. You have the Premier of Nova Scotia diving overboard. You have René Lévesque, who's paddling in the opposite direction of everyone else. Well, of course, the symbolism is straightforward. And Peter Lougheed is sitting there. He's not paddling at all. He's just hanging on to his oil wells and scowling and looking at Bill Davis and Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So, which is the correct public image? Is the image of 1864 correct, the public image of tremendous respectability, or is the image of 1981, 1982 correct? And this, for me, made me think about the whole question of image and how we relate to our political leaders. Because we don't know them, 31 million people in a country, we don't all know them personally. What we do relate to is the image that they carve out for themselves, how they dress, how they portray themselves, how they speak, the language that they use, the image by which they would like to be known, or the image by which their opponents would like them to be known. And I thought that those two pieces, 1864, 1982, really captured the question of image beautifully, and from there I built an exhibition.
Can you tell me where some of these artifacts come from? Where do they originate?
All of the artifacts are held in our national collection, and I must stress the importance of a collection to a museum. A collection to a museum is like the collection of books to a library or a collection of documents to a national archives. So all of these are taken from the national collection. They have been gathered together over time, either through donations, occasionally there's a purchase, but really we're not funded to make major purchases. You know, we're not out there in the marketplace like the Smithsonian or the British Museum, unfortunately. We just don't have those kinds of resources. So we really do depend tremendously on the goodwill and the interest of Canadians and others. We're able to give people tax receipts, and so they really do benefit very nicely when they make a donation. So it's, there is a benefit here. In our national collection, we have so many different items, whether they be contemporary, whether they be historical, and that's how we develop an exhibition, by drawing on the collections.
Is there any one item that is a particularly interesting story behind it, possibly the person who owned it, or something that is rare or unique?
Can I share a personal item? Come forward with me, and I'm going to show you an item that I personally donated to the museum. I don't get a tax receipt, by the way. If I donate something, that's simply out of the love of putting it into the museum. This is a reproduction here of a caricature that appeared in the Montreal Star, the late lamented Montreal Star, one of the great newspapers that Canada used to have. And of course we still have fine newspapers today, but the Montreal Star had a weekly column. This wasn't a single column, it was a full-page article that the editor of the day used to write on contemporary issues. And this was an article that was written about the state of politics in the day, and it was called The View from O'Connor Street. And the cartoon itself, which was drawn by Ed McNally, who was quite famous at the time, shows a politician from the Ralliement Créditiste, so the social credit party based in Quebec. And the figure who is speaking in the garret, the attic of a rooming house, looks tremendously like Réal Cahouette. And he's holding forth to an audience of one other MP and to an audience of two pigeons that are standing outside or sitting outside the window. There's also a bottle of milk sitting outside a window. Obviously, he had to have his milk for his morning coffee. I remember the article very, very well. I remember lying on my parents' living room floor. They had a nice carpet on the floor, and reading it from beginning to end. We read 3,000-word articles in those days, and it was a humorous article about what was likely to become the rebirth of an interest in separatism, a word that was hardly known at the time. This is 1963, so the Parti Québécois doesn't even exist. And I particularly remembered the image, the physical image of the politician by himself with one friend in a rooming house, just holding forth and talking about political issues of the day. So years later, I dug up that cartoon. Fortunately, it had been given to my wife as a gift, and she had kept it down in the basement, and I brought it here to the museum, and we went and did the research, and we found the original article that explained the whole context. I love it. For me, it expresses both humor and respect for the life of the ordinary backbench MP, and it also respectfully talks about issues that were only becoming part of the public agenda at the time.
Do you have a favorite piece that has a personal attraction to you, and why?
You know, right over here to my right is a canoe paddle, and this is a canoe paddle that was left on Parliament Hill at the time when Mr. Trudeau had just died, and his body was being held in honor on display, of course, in its coffin, and people lined up by the thousands, to come and pay respects. And many people left behind small notes or other tokens of personal appreciation. This paddle was left behind by a family living in Canada, and they wrote on it, and I'm going to read to you what they wrote. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, you have influenced Canadians in every way. Your vision has become a reality. We are very proud and free and unified. Our deepest respect and the name of the family. And this became part of the collection of the museum. And it is so personal because it's how that family felt about such an important figure in our political life. And so in a sense it links the individual citizen to the much broader issue of political leadership, people who have given their lives as political leaders. It's their sense of his public image, to come back to that question of image. And for them, the image is, you are a great statesman. Now, other people had a very different image of Mr. Trudeau. Other people were much more critical. But for me, personally reacting to these personal words from a family, that I think goes to the heart of the democratic relationship between the electors and the elected.
What has been the public reaction to this display, sir?
Oh, we see people walking by and stopping and reading and spending 10, 15 minutes just looking at the different artifacts. You see older people walking by and kind of stopping a grandchild and saying, look, that's Mr. Trudeau. Or there's one over here where always people stop, and that is a carving of John Diefenbaker, the Right Honourable John George Diefenbaker. It's called John Diefenbachs, the carver at the time, making fun of the fact that the Canadian dollar had declined below par with the American dollar. Well, it's declined a lot more since then for reasons that go well beyond John Diefenbaker. In fact, many of them are positive reasons. But it is a wonderful visual image of that carver's view of John Diefenbaker.
Are there other displays of a political nature here in this museum or other locations that you know about?
We have, of course, so many different exhibitions in both the War Museum and the Museum of Civilization. And those different exhibitions will have a political dimension to them in some cases. For example, in our First Peoples Hall, one portion of it deals with the changing relationship of treaties and treaty negotiations. So they aren't specifically political, but they are dealing with the impacts of political decisions on everyday life or even on military history.
When you look at some of the items, are there memories or thoughts that come to mind about the people that are connected to them?
Oh, of course, of course. It's the nature of looking at an object, an artifact, that you really start to think about the person behind the object, whether it be the carver or the painter or the cartoonist, or if you want, the individual who is being talked about. Let me give you an example. Over here in this area, we have 4 different artifacts that deal with John Diefenbaker. John Diefenbaker, a tremendously controversial and influential individual in his day. So you have a plate, which is a commemorative plate, which shows John Diefenbaker as the statesman. And there he is, his face is full, his eyes are serious. John George Diefenbaker, a great statesman. Right up above it, is a reproduction of the Canadian Bill of Rights. And let's remember that it was under Mr. Diefenbaker's government that the first Bill of Rights was adopted by the Parliament of Canada, and that in many ways was a great starting point for the eventual Charter of Canadian Rights in the Constitution. But then below that, we have the carving of Mr. Diefenbaker, making him look just a little bit nutty, just a little bit off the wall. And you may recall that as Mr. Diefenbaker would speak and his voice would reverberate and his head would shake, Mr. Speaker, I can hear it in my ears of memory. Well, this is what the carver has tried to capture, Mr. Speaker. And right beside that is perhaps one of the most touching artifacts of all. It is a campaign hat from the 1967 convention, the convention where John Diefenbaker was finally removed from power within the Conservative Party. But look at the labels on the cap. They are hand-typed by a supporter, hand-typed on the old orator typeface, and then hand-glued onto the hat. And it says things like, "You cannot go wrong by staying with John. You've got no beef with Dief," and other slogans like that. This is from the heart. This is from an ordinary political activist, probably a Westerner, who came to support John Diefenbaker. And the hat expresses both emotion and commitment, and it is totally in contrast with what the cartoonist did with his carving, and also in contrast with those very, very serious face of John Diefenbaker on a commemorative plate, because this one is from the heart. All the others have been studied and prepared in advance.
What kind of educational or entertainment value is offered by this collection?
Oh, people walk by, they stop, they laugh, they point, they ask, they say, we have a cup here that shows the face of a Jean Drapeau, and you hear people saying, souvent en français, parce qu'ils vont parler en français, so they're talking French to each other, "Hey, is that Jean Drapeau? Do I see Jean Drapeau?" And they laugh about it, so clearly they're being entertained. But more important is the educational value, because really what it's doing is it's saying to the visitor, think about the image that we have of political elected people, and think about how image is a way of simplifying and understanding what it is that that political person is saying. We don't say, let's have an analysis of the free trade agreement. What we do say is, well, what do you think of Brian Mulroney? And in that way, image of a person becomes a code word, a simple way of trying to get to the heart of a complex issue. We don't say, what do you think of the patriation of the Constitution, and what do you think of the Charter of Rights? We might just say, well, Pierre Trudeau, what does he mean to you, or what did he mean to you? And there too, it's the image of the man that becomes a code, a shorthand for understanding complex issues. So it's highly educational to remind us that the complexity of politics does get reduced to simple things, simple questions of how do you think about this person, what do you think of that person?
What do you think in the coming years museums could put on display for current politicians?
Oh, well, we're going to be doing something here at the Museum of Civilization that will open in, about 3 months' time. And it's called Face to Face, the Canadian Personalities Hall. And what we are doing there is showing biography in connection with various individuals, some political, many not political. And we're trying to look at individuals, who they were, what they were like, what can we learn about them from objects that they've left behind. For example, we have a drinking flask from Sir John A. Macdonald, and it really tells us something about the importance and the acceptability in his day of people having a quick nip simply as part of being alive and being well. Many, many other objects. One horrible object, one terrible object, and yet profoundly important. And it's the pistol that, in all probability, shot the bullet that killed Darcy McGee. Darcy McGee, one of the founders of Canada, one of the fathers of Confederation, who got a bullet through his head just minutes after leaving Parliament in 1868. We do have that pistol, which will help to remind us about the man Darcy McGee, what he stood for, how he changed his points of view over time, why it is that he became such a lightning rod for different views and different opinions. But there's a deeper question, and the deeper question is, are we capable in a museum of dealing with contemporary political debates, debates of today in a museum setting? Well, at the War Museum right now, we have a very important exhibition on the Canadian role in Afghanistan. And that's a photographic exhibition with some artifacts. It was done by two different journalists, one photojournalist, one video journalist. That's contemporary. It's dealing with an issue. But we have a problem, and I'll be very frank with you. We have a problem in Canada with public institutions dealing with contemporary political issues. People get very angry, people get very upset, and they'll say, what are you, as an institution, displaying that for? Or why are you expressing that point of view? Why aren't you expressing this point of view? And I'm not sure if we have quite the cultural maturity yet to deal in a public museum setting with hard contemporary issues. I'll have to test that. I'd like to see us try to push the boundaries on that. But I can tell you that I think that as soon as we deal with a contemporary question, we will be on the receiving end of so many letters from so many different points of view, all of them aiming at the politicians. Bev Oda, why don't you tell the museum to change? Mr. Prime Minister, why don't you tell the museum to change? And we require a certain cultural maturity to accept that we can deal with contemporary political dispute and political debate in a public institution. I'm not sure we're there. I hope we are.
If you could obtain any item in the world connected to political life to add to your display, what would it be and why?
Oh, there's so many interesting objects or pieces of clothing that symbolize a certain period and a certain time. But you know, there was one that was in the press just a little while ago that's very Canadian, and I'll draw your attention to it. You may recall that some months ago there was a delegation of older representatives of the Chinese Canadian community who came to Ottawa in order to receive the formal public apology offered in a heartfelt way, in an open way, by the government. And they also received compensation for wrongs that had been done in the past. One of the elderly gentlemen who came to Ottawa came with what he described as being one of the spikes from the building of the first transcontinental railroad. And you know how important Chinese laborers were in the building of the railroad. And he gave that spike in a small box to the Prime Minister, Mr. Harper. Well, one of these days, I really hope that that spike and that box and the photograph of him giving it will be brought into the museum so that we can put it on display, and so that tens of thousands of visitors, in fact hundreds of thousands of visitors, will be able to see it and see some explanation of it, and in that way hundreds of thousands of people will come to understand what is symbolized by the spike, by the photograph, by the explanation. I think if I could pinpoint one item at this moment, that's the item that I'd love to have in the museum right now.
Dr. Victor Rabinovitch, thank you very much for your time today, sir.
It's a real pleasure, and thank you for taking an interest in this.